what I want to talk about is prime ministers and see if they work, and the way they operate and the power that they have. And the interesting question then is exactly what is being handed over, a position or power and authority, and what is the nature of that power that goes with it. And I thought I'd start with an antidote to the notion of powerful prime ministers and talk about the time when Harry Truman was looking at his successor, Eisenhower. This, after all, comes just after the imperial presidency of Franklin Roosevelt. And he says he'll sit here and he'll say, do this, do that, and nothing will happen. Poor Ike. It won't be like anything like the army. He'll find it very frustrating. And then he actually explains what he thought he'd been doing for the previous 6 years. I sit here all day trying to persuade people to do things they ought to have sense enough to do without my persuading them. That's all the powers of the presidency amount to. So after 6 years in the job, and not always a happy 6 years, but 6 years in the job, he makes the point that presidents, even presidents, cannot command, or cannot command effectively. And yet, we still live with the notion that we have almost an imperial prime minister. I think you can guarantee that within 6 or 8 months, some journalist will write an article which explains how Tony Abbott governs, will point out that he actually dictates everything to his ministers and they do as they're told. He's centralized, he's increased the power, and they would argue never before has a prime minister wielded so much power in any country under the Westminster system. And they will look back with nostalgia to the days when we really had cabinet government, when prime ministers were the first among equals. The problem is they tend to be rather bad historians. If you look at one comment about prime ministers, he did everything alone, whilst those ciphers of the cabinet signed everything he dictated, without the least a share of honour or power. It was known that this minister, having obtained a sole influence over all our public councils, has not only got the sole direction of all public affairs, but got every officer of state removed that would not follow his direction, even in the affairs belonging to his own department. So here's an argument that, of course, the Prime Minister dealt with everything and did everything back in the previous days of cabinet government, except when you work it out that that was written in 1741, and it was the first Prime Minister ever, Robert Walpole, who was already being accused of being a single person running the show by himself. Or you can have another one, a cabinet of ciphers and a government of one man alone, which was William Pitt in 1806. And a third British one, a sole minister decidedly superior to all. Ministers dare not have an opinion, but must move either to the right or to the left as this dictator thinks proper. Now, you can imagine people writing that of a large number of Australian prime ministers in the last 10 or 20 years, and certainly about some British prime ministers, but in fact it's the Duke of Wellington in 1829. Duke of Wellington actually went to his first meeting, and afterwards he said it was strange, it was very strange. I gave them their orders and they wanted to stand around and discuss them. My point is, of course, that in Britain the notion that prime ministers were more than first among equals goes back to the very beginning of time. And Britain's not the only place where it can happen. If you look at the examples of Canada, you can see a similar sort of example of a prime minister who, having had a discussion, said it was lengthy and eventually became so wearisome that I interposed, informing my colleagues that they had acquainted me with their views, that the duty of decision rested with me, and I would subsequently make them acquainted with my conclusion. That's to say, at the end of some time in the future, we'll tell you what Cabinet decided. And that, of course, goes back to the World War I, when a Prime Minister there was again dictating. And another Canadian story, the story went around that Bennett was seen mumbling to himself he was holding a Cabinet meeting. He was not above asking the opinions of others, he was just above accepting them. We're now talking about Bennett in the 1930s. And in case you want an Australian one to prove there's nothing new there either, who decided now that modern autocrat the Premier? Why should the direct representative of the people delegate to one man that power and those responsibilities with which they've been entrusted by the people? Now, there are as many Australian state premiers that you might refer to that in many of the Queensland cases, but in fact, again, it's written in 1897 when at the Constitutional Conventions. So when we talk about prime ministers regarding being seen as powerful, and when we're suggesting that they ignore cabinet, and when we look at either the British or the Australian or the Canadians, the history goes back as long as you have prime ministers and as long as you have premiers. The first Canadian prime minister, John Macdonald, was notorious for wanting to keep control over everything that was happening. The appointment of every postmaster, every detail that might influence his election again in a few years' time. And those who look back with nostalgia to a day of cabinet government look back to a day that never existed. Prime ministers have always tried to exercise power. The question is, what are the tools available to them? How well do they do it? And what sort of challenges do they face? Now, what I want to do is actually suggest that the powers of the imperial prime minister are less great without the skills of a very dedicated and successful politician wielding them in the first place. And in a sense, that becomes obvious when you look back at the history of our time. Different prime ministers succeed or fail even though they have nominally the same sorts of powers. It's not just about circumstance. It's not just about what happens there in those days. It's about judgment and the success which can actually go with it. But before I do that, I want to sort of provide some sort of overview of what I think is actually important when we start talking about prime ministers. It's a definition of politics written in the early 1970s in a book on social politics in Britain and Sweden by Hugh Heclo. And he said, politics finds its sources not only in power, but also in uncertainty. Men wondering collectively what to do. This was written pre-Margaret Thatcher. Governments not only power, they also puzzle. Policy making is a form of collective puzzlement on society's behalf. It entails both deciding and knowing. These days, people talk about evidence-based policy, as though the policy in the past wasn't evidence-based. And in so doing, they assume a certain degree of consistency in the provision of information and the time to do it. But let me give you two stories about policy making in reality. One British, one Australian. The British one is the 31st of March, 1982, when Margaret Thatcher in London was informed that the Argentinians were about to invade the Falklands. And she had around her three senior ministers, the Foreign Minister, the Defence Minister, the Chief of Defence Staff, and a series of other advisors. And she looks at them and said, "What are we going to do?" And they all sort of look at the ceiling. "We've got to take them back." "No, we can't." "We've got to take them back." "We can't. We don't have the capacity to do it." And no one's prepared to argue or back her up. They just look at her. Now, it's not that they were cowards. Three of those ministers had won the Military Cross in the Second World War. A fourth had served as an officer in the Malaysians' emergency as an officer in the Gurkhas. They knew what war was about, but they didn't see how they could possibly take back an army, a set of islands so far away. And besides, the Foreign Office had spent the previous 10 years trying to lease them back. Tell the Argentinians, you can have the lease, we'll just take a 100-year lease and then we can go on and pretend nothing had happened. And into the meeting comes the first Sea Lord. And he had come back from an inspection in Portsmouth, been briefed what happened, and the briefing notes basically said to him, "Don't touch it." He was mildly annoyed because the government had been cutting back the naval ships in the cuts in the previous year. He had fought against it and lost, but he walks in, they say in a full dress uniform, in to see his minister and finds the Prime Minister there, which is great because it saves him time. And he looks at the Prime Minister and says, "Prime Minister, do I have permission to set up a task force?" And she said, "Yes." What would that entail? So he explains how you set up a task force. And then she says to him, "And how long would it take?" To set up the task force, 3 days. To get to the Falklands, 3 weeks. She said, "Don't you mean 3 days?" Which shows her sense of geography wasn't great. And she said, "No, 3 weeks." "Okay, do it." So one person coming in at the relevant time gives Maggie the capacity to do what she wants to do. Without that person, without that timing, she would not have had the ability, because she didn't know how to do it, to set up a task force and head off to the Falklands to take it back. And everyone, of course, was extremely nervous, because how could you get the air power? I mean, there's an interesting irony in this. 2 aircraft carriers went off to the Falklands. One was the Invincible, and the other was the Hermes. A decision had just been made to scrap the Hermes, and a decision had been made to sell the Invincible to Australia. If Galtieri had waited 6 months, Britain wouldn't have had the capacity to take back the Falklands, because they wouldn't have had any aircraft carriers to send with it. They wouldn't have had the ability to protect the troops who went in on that occasion. And then Margaret Thatcher started getting advice. She gets the minister, the Permanent Secretary of Defence, sits him down over a gin and tonic and says, "How do you run a war?" And he said, "Well, you set up a war cabinet, you have 3 or 4 ministers in it, and you keep the bureaucrats out," which is basically what Macmillan came and told her the next day and what she did. But here you have a Prime Minister who is not short of the desire to do things, but needs the support and the advice to tell them how to do things on these particular occasions. And the irony is that if the First Sea Lord had come into a meeting when she wasn't there, the advice would almost certainly never have reached her, because he would have been advising the Minister of Defence, who would not have passed on the information, because the Chief of Defence Forces, who was actually an admiral, didn't think that it was possible. So it's not just a case of do you have the power, it's do you have the capacity, do you have the ability, and what can you do? And they never knew in that stage whether or not it was going to be possible. My second case is the global financial crisis. And its image of the Rudd government, or the inner councils of the Rudd government, what turned out to be the Special Priorities and Budget Review Committee, sitting around in Canberra on the 6th and the 7th of October, trying to work out how we respond to this international crisis that's engulfing the world. Well, most of them are there. The Treasurer is actually sitting in the son of the councillor in Washington's bedroom, because it was the only place they could get a secure phone. So you had this disembodied voice coming into the cabinet room from outside. And information is coming in. The Icelandic banks are collapsing. The Irish are guaranteeing all bank loans. The car companies can't borrow the money to keep the fleets on the floor. A number of financial houses are likely to be going under. What do we do? The information changes hour by hour as you understand what is going wrong in North America, what is going wrong in Australia, what are the likely calculations. Is there going to be a run on the banks? People are ringing the banks up to ask them if their money is safe. And governments must decide. Without knowing what the information is, without being clear what's going to happen, they must make decisions. The information was coming in on a regular basis, and the story was getting worse and worse all the time. And Rudd's judgment was, we push harder. Ken Henry comes in and says, sort of, go hard, go fast, go households. And Rudd's calculation is, well, better to overshoot and pull back than to undershoot and have to go again in very quick time. So here's a case of a group of people surrounded by 5 or 6 key advisors from the Treasury and Finance and from their offices, making judgments on the basis of ever-changing information, but always knowing that the one thing they can't do is wait and the one thing they can't do is nothing. It's a matter of puzzling. It's a matter of deciding and knowing, and not necessarily in any particular order that underpins what prime ministers must do much of the time. It's obviously so in wartime, but it's particularly difficult in other times of economic crisis. So that's, in a sense, what I want to try and get at about how prime ministers can utilize the resources they have with what sort of purpose. What's their job? Well, that was Hugh Heckler. Here's a description to a prime minister of what the job is. It says, there are lots of things people want you to do, and lots of things you should do, and a number of things you can do, but very few things you have to do. It's up to you. You're the boss. By which stage, of course, it's probably a giveaway that the quote actually comes from Yes, Prime Minister, and Bernard Woolley advising the Prime Minister. And they actually then do a calculation. You know, Bernard says to Jim Hacker, well, what do you have to do? He said, Cabinet, 2 hours a week. Question time, half an hour a week. Cabinet committees, 2.5 hours a week. Meeting with the Queen, half an hour a week. That's 6 hours. That's all you have to do. And Hacker looks a little bit surprised, and of course no Prime Minister will do that. But what it summarises is the distinction between what he has to do as a Prime Minister and what he can do as a Prime Minister. And to some extent I want to actually look at some of the things which determine what they actually do and the sorts of challenges which they have to get on top of in order to win. So firstly, scheduling. At the beginning of the year, the Prime Minister's office will write in all the things that they must do. It's the things that go with the job, what we call the prerogatives of the Prime Minister. So question time and parliamentary sittings will go in because the Prime Minister has to be there. International meetings, the summatory, all those meetings that they're currently talking to which are growing in numbers because the Prime Minister ideally has to be there for the G20, for the APEC, for all the numerous international organisations. No longer the luxury of going by boat, as Menzies used to do. 3 weeks there, a test match or two, a few meetings, and 3 weeks home again. Life was a little slower. Nor, I might add, when we talk about prime ministers being one-man bands, was it quite like Billy Hughes, who at one stage went to England in about April, May 1918, and arrived back from England in October 1919. He ran the country for 15 months while he was overseas as Prime Minister. I don't think you could get away with that these days. The Cabinet used to complain that they discovered their Cabinet decisions by reading the newspapers. It was sort of shades of CNN. But firstly then, Prime Ministers have to do a certain number of things. You don't get away half an hour these days, or not in Australia, for question time. You have to prepare for question time every day. Question time can last an hour, and the Prime Minister can get just about every second question. So preparing for that becomes a continuous pressure. So you decide on what you must do, chairing Cabinet, all those sorts of things. The second one is the matter of choice. What are the priorities that the Prime Minister may want to do? What are the things? Well, some are pushed upon them. You must do economics. But the other ones are very much matters of choice. How much you do yourself and how much you give to your colleagues. So you do economics, but are you worried about law reform? Are you worried about foreign affairs, or would you prefer not to? I think increasingly Prime Ministers have to actually do that. Are you worried about health policy? Every now and then Prime Ministers give jobs to ministers on the ground they actually don't want to hear from them. They want it off the agenda. They want it to be quiet. Trust. It helps to delegate if you trust the person to whom you've delegated it, but trust is often a comparatively short commodity within a government. The great irony of a parliamentary system is that sitting around the cabinet table are not only your successor and your successor's likely successor, but several other people who probably think they can do the job as well. And if you look at British, Canadian, Australian politics, it's driven by the most wonderful rivalries that you can look at. Obviously, in Britain, Blair and Brown for 13 years or 10 years or so dominated. In Canada, you can have Trudeau and Turner. You can have Chrétien and Martin. In Australia, you can have Fraser and Peacock. You can have Hawke and Keating, Rudd and Gillard. The duos who compete all the time means that when you're actually looking around the cabinet table, the question is, which of these people can I really trust to do the job? And which of them are you a little bit cautious of because suddenly they might change? And prime ministers are making these judgments constantly, and occasionally they obviously get them wrong. And you can obviously make the contrast for those who lose their jobs and those who keep their jobs when it comes to maintaining some sort of support. Information. Prime ministers are never short of information. The briefing books sort of pile high in the Prime Minister's office on every topic that you may choose. The problem, of course, is that much of the information is uncertain, but some of it's untested, much of it's ambiguous, and Prime Ministers have to make judgments on the run about what it is that they will use and what it is that they will not use and how they will use it for what purposes. Because, of course, if you're giving information that is wrong, then it comes back to bite very fast. The time pressures. Very often, Prime Ministers are not masters or mistresses of their own schedules. They're under pressure from a whole range of other people and other events. I remember a Tasmanian Premier coming to talk to one of our students. And he said that in one morning, he got up and thought it was going to be a nice, quiet day. And by 10 o'clock, he had a ministerial scandal, a couple of economic crises, and goodness knows what else, and nothing happened that day the way that they expected it to. The same happens, of course, when you're Prime Minister. Things occur which get forced upon the agenda, and the neatly determined schedule that you start with becomes completely ruined as the pressures of time. And then it's the pressures of getting decisions made and moving on to the next item and managing to adjust from one to the other. So they have assistance, a lot of assistance. One of the big changes in the last 30 years is the size of the Prime Minister's office, now up to something like 50 people sitting around, in seats sort of around the Prime Minister's office, there to provide assistance on any item. And of course, modern technology means that you can do it. My Billy Hughes, when he was running it from Britain, once sent a telegram and said he wanted to know every cabinet decision before it was announced. This actually meant, of course, getting the cabinet decision, coding it, sending it, decoding it, allowing the Prime Minister to read it, coding his answer, sending it, and bringing it back. And at one stage, they wrote back and said that the telegram you sent last week on one cabinet meeting cost £100. So some time ago, I got May to go and look up the prices of houses in Melbourne in 1916. And a terraced house in Melbourne cost about £300. These days, that meant that telegram costs probably somewhere in the region of about $200,000, one telegram. Technology has changed. These days, the complaint is that the VIP jets actually have a phone that you can keep in touch with the world outside. I think that sort of Arthur Sinodinos used to complain that the great thing about the past was you used to get the Prime Minister to yourself for a time. Now they're always in touch with people ringing up to keep telling you what's happening. The speed of things has happened in the past. So we now expect more of our Prime Ministers. But scheduling, choice, trust, information, life becomes comparatively difficult. Where do you exercise it? Well, Prime Ministers need to keep the support of their cabinet. I'd argue the cabinet does two things. It's about policy coherence, making sure that you are reasonably consistent, and it's about policy support, making sure that the cabinet ministers are reasonably satisfied with the way that the operation is running. Rudd got hammered at various times for running his SPBCs, Strategic Priorities and Budget Committee. But every Prime Minister has at some stage had a preferred arena for discussing things which are not given to all the members of Cabinet all the time. Sometimes it's in the Prime Minister's office. Sometimes it becomes a small organisation with a title but sort of no meetings. Sometimes it becomes the National Security Committee, which was Howard's position of choice for many of his decisions. There was nothing unusual about the Strategic Priorities Budget Committee that Rudd ran. Where he failed to do was to persuade the other ministers on a continuing basis that they were sufficiently involved, that they were prepared to live with the decisions. And they did for about 18 months. Only one minister ever complained. But eventually, enough of them got upset that when movements took place, they joined them. So you need to keep your support of Cabinet. It's not just about making policy. You need to keep your support of the party. Now, the Labour Party may have made Prime Ministers, if there is another one, slightly secure on the grounds that they are not so easy to remove if the current method of electing them gets endorsed. But party members are invariably nervous and sometimes ideological and arguing against the Prime Minister within the party room. Parliament's contested. Preparing for question time is difficult. You never quite know where they're coming from. Most Prime Ministers will put aside a couple of hours, in fact, to be ready for Prime Minister, whether they read it itself or whether they have a briefing process, which means they're being tested by their staff and by the public service about what might actually come. The media has become increasingly antagonistic, increasingly challenging on a regular basis, and they have a 24-hour media agenda which they have to fill. So two things happen. One is they look for any story that they can find, and they will beat one up if they can't find one. But two is constantly, Prime Ministers are now under review. They are never off duty. They are never in a position where they can say, you know, I can relax and say what I like, because everyone's got a mobile phone which has got a camera attached, which is constantly sort of taking pictures of what actually happens. And then they have to fight occasionally against the campaigns. The electorate is becoming more intractable, less easy to persuade, more higher expectations. The classic, I would have thought, in the last election was the decision on fringe benefit tax on cars, in which people were asked to please keep a record of what you do. It created uproar in Sydney as the people there regarded this was an entitlement that they had been given and that you cannot take away. It's easy to give. In politics, it's very difficult to take away, and the expectations now of the electorate, rather like of students, are immediate response, please. We sent you an email yesterday and we haven't had a response yet. Why are you not being responsive to your electorates? The pressures are ever increasing. The states are uncooperative. Even to a government of their own kind, sooner or later you can guarantee that they want to make some sort of change. And the global community is increasingly putting pressure on Australia. Now, Australia is meant to be the world's 14th largest economy, which merely points out that the 174 that are smaller are really quite small indeed. And of course, we talk about a middle power. I think it was Peter Walsh who said he'd never come across a Prime Minister who didn't massively overstate his international influence. And I think much of the time that's probably true. But they have to play in our own backyard, in our own region, in the G20, and in a variety of other forums. And you have to accept to some extent the demands which are being put on you, or at least negotiate them with other people. These are the things which other people want you to do, for which Prime Ministers need some sort of support. So what sums up a sort of argument about Prime Ministers? I said it's non-sequential, can occur in any order, which I suppose is ultimately a tautology. But the neat descriptions of how Prime Ministers decide, I think, is seldom actually accurate. I probably could have put those 6 things in almost any order, and they would have been equally true. There are times when Prime Ministers know what they want to do and then look for evidence in order to get there. There are times when they work out what they're going to do on the basis of what they think they can sell, so that selling becomes the first stage about what will the population accept, and then we work out how we're going to get there. They may know what's going to happen before or after they actually make a decision. These are the sorts of pressures, I think, under which they have to operate, because life is a sort of kaleidoscopic rush of ideas, events, personalities, and challenges which prime ministers have to deal with. Now, a prime minister who knows what they want, isolates their highest priorities, ignores the rest, and has a fortunate public run may be able to achieve quite remarkable things. A prime minister who doesn't have those is likely to struggle even with the same powers. If you look back over the last 20 or 30 years, I would suggest that in technical terms, I'm not going to argue about whether I agree with what they did or not, but in technical terms, the two best prime ministers that Australia has had are Bob Hawke and John Howard. Because Bob Hawke ran and they were very different sorts of prime ministers. Bob Hawke ran a cabinet process in which he gave considerable independence to his ministers except where he cared and wanted to get involved, and when things became problematic he moved in and helped, but he allowed people to talk. And he actually surprised many of his ministers by the degree to which he was prepared to let them talk, and they would let them have some sort of independence. So for the first 5 or 6 years, and I think all prime ministers ran out of steam, he actually ran a government which could make major changes because he backed the strong ministers when they wanted to do dramatic things. Howard ran a government that didn't leak, that did some quite challenging things like introduce a new tax, which everyone previously said was impossible at an election campaign. He ran a tight government and he kept the support, unlike Hawke, of his party. Costello never got close to getting the numbers which to give him the job that he wanted. That he didn't over a long period of time is a testament to Howard's capacity to talk to the people, to look after the political support, as well as the political coherence. So we have successful prime ministers and we have unsuccessful prime ministers. When they're successful, they are actually unchallengeable. No overmighty prime minister has ever been thrown out, because the support they get just from their success makes them basically untouchable. It's not till they are shaky, until they start looking for and asking for support, that you know that they're actually having some sort of difficulty. Now, I'm not asking people to be sympathetic to prime ministers. They want the job, they fight for the job, and generally they walk through buckets of blood, to quote Neville Wran, in order to get there. But the notion that we have of overpowerful prime ministers, of prime ministers who click their fingers and the world works, is not the prime ministers that we actually have in this or any other country. What we need are the prime ministers who've got some of the skills. So the image of prime ministers is one of great power. That picture is true if the individual has the powers of persuasion, the skills of manipulation, the vision to direct, the ambition to drive, and the energy to work. There are a number of, I think, important characteristics. Then, and only then, may the Prime Minister turn all that potential into results. I wrote that actually at the end of a book on Malcolm Fraser, which I published horrifyingly now 25 years ago. And I would still stand by that. The test for Tony Abbott as he becomes Prime Minister, as he has the handover of power from Kevin Rudd, is whether or not he's got those sorts of skills, whether he's got that sort of capacity which allows him to maximize the opportunity that he has. Because you know he'll never be entirely in control of events. You know there will be people around who would quite like to have his job if he's going to start failing. You know he's got a lot of backbenchers who are nervous about whether they'll be re-elected. And you know there's a party machine out there which is concerned about whether or not you're fulfilling all the obligations that you have. So prime ministers are given potential, but not given power. We need to understand the pressures under which they work. We need to sort of get away from this notion that they click their fingers and everything happens, and then we'll get a rather better idea about how we're actually governed. Thank you.